2021, and here we are still talking about promises, observables, and in general asynchronous JavaScript. So what's up, Simonics, and welcome back to our deep dive into asynchronous code. It's easy to forget that, first of all, a lot of people still encounter problems with asynchronous code because they come from other languages, or they're just not used to that concept, or they kind of used to that concept but confuse a lot of the different objects like promises, observables, and the different terms related to asynchronous JavaScript. Within this video, I want to show you the origins of asynchronous code inside JavaScript. We're going to talk about callbacks, we're going to talk about the improvement promises, and we're going to talk about observables. I will show you a bit of Angular or Ionic code, but this is really just standard JavaScript stuff. It's not really tied to any framework like Angular, React, or Vue. But hopefully this is the last video you have to watch about understanding promises, observables, and asynchronous code in your JavaScript applications. So let's dive into it. Alright, so let's first travel a few years back in the history of JavaScript and why we're actually talking about this. Your JavaScript code executes in a single thread. So if you at one point in your code make an operation that takes like 5 seconds, nothing of the code below that would be executed. The idea to solve this is to make this one line asynchronous, which means you start it and the rest of the code will still be executed. And at some point you get back a result. So that is the whole idea behind asynchronous JavaScript operations. This could be an HTTP call to download an image, an API call, or any other operation that simply doesn't return anything immediately. And immediately is like you have a function and it returns a value, or it returns, of course, before all, something like this. All of this is an async operation that can immediately return a value. Now, in the past, we used callbacks. They are basically a function that you pass to a function, and we can easily see this with setTimeout. So to set timeout, you can also pass a callback. You can make this a function, and this function simply logs I am here, and it will be executed after, let's say, 1 second. Now, the problem for people coming from other languages is that if I now put a log here, this will actually be executed first. Although you think, well, this code is above that line, it should execute first. But that's not the case with async JavaScript. This is really a very important concept. Sometimes the things you see in here are not completely what you will see in reality when the code executes. So right now, the code or the program will continue to run, and this will just be executed at a later time. In fact, it is a callback. It will be called back later at a later point. You could also extract this into a function. So you could also make this another function here, and ignore. And then you could also pass this .bar in here. Would be basically the same. No overload matches this call. Oh my god, what did I do? I'm not returning anything? Come on, Mac, please don't confuse me even more. I don't want to do it like this. So now we got our callback function passed in here. It's still the same. But the problem is what is called callback hell. So if you chain a lot of these, it can look like a Christmas tree. You go down the callback hell, you chain even more of them, and it just leads to a lot of problems. If you're using a framework like Angular, you don't really see this very often right now. But what you see is promises in a lot of places. Promises were the improvement to those callbacks. And promises look basically like this. So let me get a bit of space in here. So you call a function, pass any value to it, and this function immediately returns a promise. A promise is basically like it's promising you to give you something back in the future. This could either be a successful result, which is usually handled with a then block, or it could be an error with a catch block. If you use any NPM library, if you use Ionic components, or Angular stuff, you usually see promises all over the place. Now, how can you find out if something is a promise? Well, that is actually pretty easy if you use a decent IDE. So let's say I want to make this function return a promise. I could just return a new promise. It got a resolve and a reject parameter, which I think I should put into brackets. And let's say here we got a success value. If success is true, I want to call the resolve, yeah. Otherwise, I want to call reject, oh no. And that's basically our promise. I think more brackets are necessary. So you can also create your own promises and wrap other things in it. This is just a super simple example. Now, right now, if you call the bar function, you might not be sure if it is actually returning a promise or immediately a result. And you can clarify this quite easily with the right IDE when you see this coming up. So you see you got catch finally, and then the functions available of a promise. If you want to even make it more explicit, add types if you're using TypeScript. So make this promise any or string or whatever you want, and then your IDE will pick this up correctly. And you can use the result. Let's whatever do. So if we pass true to this one, we should get back the resolve of year in here. Once again, if I now put the same log below here and log this out, put test in here, guess which line will be executed first? Yes, this one. Even though we're just returning a promise, we're not doing any kind of heavy operation. This code is async, and the program will first of all step into this line before actually diving into the then block of our promise right here. So once again, just to make this clear, let's say we have my var up here, we set this to whatever, and we're gonna change this string within the then block of our promise. That's the usual problem that I see many make. And then they put another log in here, or try to work with the value because I got that value in that line. So now I can test it and I can work with the result of my var. The problem is, once again, this line execute first, so it has still the whatever value from the beginning. Only in here we're setting it, but this after that line. So it's really important to understand that first. Quick note as well, I'm using the arrow syntax right here. I could also do this a bit differently. So I could write it as function right here, and I got back the result. The problem is now that we will hopefully see an error. Uncaught cannot set property myvar of undefined, because if you're using this, if you're using the arrow syntax, you're actually binding this to the function, which in this case is not the case. So that is an improvement you usually see. Just wanted to give you this quick little hint on the side. That's the reason why I always use these arrow functions. Now I can access this correctly. On top of that, there are a lot of ways to work with promises. For example, very common is promise.all, which waits until an array of promises is finished. This is kind of cool if you got multiple HTTP requests that you simply all want to execute before you do anything else. The problem is that if you use promise.all, let's do this with my simple function. I will call it with true, I will call it with false, and I will call it with true again. So let's log my test out. Actually, I should do test.then. And what we see in this case is that promise.all is actually not the best way, because one of our promises was rejected, and there's today a better way, and that is called all settled. If you get a red underline asking you to change the lab to compiler option ES 2020, yeah, I can do this. That's a TypeScript setting, but in general, your code will still work. And what you see now is that our code is actually executed, and you get for each of the promises the status fulfilled, rejected, fulfilled, and the value or the reason. So if you're working with promises, promise.all is something you have to keep in mind. or if you want to use the improved version, which might not be available on every browser that you use, but all settled, will be the better way to handle this in the future for sure. To make things even more interesting, there's a new concept called async await, which you can also use with promises to completely confuse you, although it doesn't really change a thing. The only thing async await changes is how your code looks. Now, take a look at this. We will do it once again. We will put our log in here. We will say this one is test, and we will once again log my variable. Now, if you're using async await, maybe we shouldn't do this in the constructor. I don't know. I think we don't want to do this in the constructor. Let's do it in my function. Let's call this .my function. If you want to use async await, you can skip this whole then logic, which can still nest your code. Although then has a lot of benefits. For example, I could now return in here another promise or value and then use then again with that value. So you could build up a nice chain of then in here. That's actually quite okay, I would say. It's not the best way. I think observables, about which we'll talk in a second as well, are better, but this could be a way. But async await makes this cool. So now we can say whatever. I really run out of names today. My name, and I put await in front of a function that returns a promise. Now this will give you an error. Usually you should mark the function as async. That's why it's called async await. Now we can use it, and what you notice is what did I do with this function? I have no idea what it returns. Could we put my name? Kind of confusing today. Now what this line does is it will still execute the promise right here from our bar function, but the value will be immediately available in the next line. So basically the program waits in here theoretically and then continues with the rest. So it's not making an excursus and goes on with the rest of the code in here, but really by using the await keyword in here, it waits in that line until the promise is either resolved or rejected. I don't know if I like it or not. It definitely makes the code more readable. If you compare it, it really looks a lot easier. But if you're a beginner, I really feel like this is more explicitly saying, okay, this is async code and this will be executed at a later point. If it's just in one line, I feel like this could confuse people. So really, it's just about the syntax and making the code more readable. Decide for yourself if you like this more or if you like async await more. I use both in different cases, so there's really no one is better than the other. Now you're happy that you understood promises. They work quite nicely for you. They return a value in the future and you're happy about that. Only until you notice that there are also observables. So what are observables now? Well, a promise, as we've seen in the previous examples, simply returns one value or it rejects once. An observable, on the other hand, is, as the word says, something observing something else. It's like observing a stream of events. So that means an observable could have multiple events popping up in the future. It's like listening to a click event or listening to database changes if you use something like Firebase with an open connection. So you need to understand that, for example, the Angular HTTP client by default uses observables. If I now make an HTTP GET request to, do I have something like a dummy URL? Yeah, of course I got. This now returns an observable. And how can I tell that this is an observable if I don't know what I'm doing? Once again, your IDE is your best friend. In this case, we don't see the then, catch, and finally options, but instead we see this is scalar, subscribe, whatever, and that means we need to subscribe to an observable to activate it. If you just create an observable like this, actually nothing would happen. We're not making an HTTP call. This is just a cold observable, and this becomes does it become a hot observable or an activated? I think an activated observable once you subscribe to it. And only at that point you will be able to see the result. At this point, I think I don't have to tell you that if I try to access a value that we got in here right after this line, it's not gonna work. We're not using async await. This is like the promise syntax. If you see those brackets and the arrow functions, you know this is an async operation. And fair enough, I get course issues, but if I refresh this, I get a result. So they're just trying to scare me on that first try. Now I got the result from the API. So observables basically are an improved way, because you can cancel an observable, you can retry them, you can use RxJS stuff on observables. So powerful reactive extension for declarative functionality. For example, I picked this simple example to show you why an observable is sometimes better. In this example in the blog, they wanted to have a search input which on change triggered an API call. If I would do this all the time, it would be a horrible experience. But with observables and RxJS logic, you can do stuff like this. You can add a debounce time, so only after 400 milliseconds it executes. It will only be changed if the value really changed. You can call a lot of different things on a observable, which is really stuff for a whole nother tutorial. So everything about RxJS operators, if you're interested in stuff like this, flat map, merge map, switch map, filter, all of that, let me know and we will go through basically all examples if you want to. So now we've seen promises which return one result, we've seen observables which can return a stream, or in this case just return one result. And usually after you understood both of them, the final enemy, the last problem is how do I combine them? Because then you're using something like Ionic storage, or you're using whatever library that returns a promise, and you're suddenly completely confused of how can I now work with promises and observables. Usually my recommendation for this case is transform your promise into an observable. That really makes a lot easier. So let's say my storage observable, this dot storage get, I think get returns a promise. Yeah. So I would just want to get something for my key, and this now is a promise. I can hover over it and I see this is a promise. Now let's say you want to retrieve a value from the storage before you make an HTTP call. A very simple example. Now you can do this by transforming your promise into an observable by simply using from. Usually my IDE is not picking up this. Oh, it is today. But actually I think from, yeah, it's no operator. So now my storage observable is magically an observable, and that makes life a lot easier because now I can subscribe to this. In fact, I wouldn't subscribe to it directly. In this case, I would have to add a pipe block first, because now I get back the value from the storage first, and then I want to pass that value to whatever. I want to do anything with it. Let's just say I want to call a map block. I want to do something and then return a different value. And then I could actually chain my other observable with switch map. So we're actually already starting to get into the next topic. We're gonna call switch map. Can we do something like this? This is the storage value. Okay, I think I lost everyone at those lines. Let's just do it like this. And at the end, we would have to subscribe, so then I could just leave this. Okay, although we haven't added the operators, which we could actually do quite quickly, map and switch map from RxJS operators. Okay, now the underline should be gone. So this would be a simple solution to combine promises and observable. And it's really important to understand that you cannot just do then and then subscribe in the same function. That's really not going to get you to the goal line. Once again, my recommendation, transform everything to a promise, to an observable, please not promise, please not. and then use it within a pipe block. Use the right RxJS tools to switch between different observables and combine the different results. Otherwise, you will really run into a lot of trouble. But first, you really need to understand the basics of the promise and the basics of the observable, as we've seen. And then the last step, you are then able to combine them and spot them within your code, especially if you use the right interface for the function, so the return value of the function, or usually your IDE is already telling you this for most of the packages today. If you run any kind of function and go about it, you will see if it returns a promise on observable, promise go with then catch finally, observable go with the pipe log and then subscribe to it. And then you hopefully shouldn't encounter any problems with async code in the future anymore. Alright, that was our deep dive into asynchronous JavaScript. I really hope I could explain the concepts in the best kind of way. I'm really shocked that this video took 20 minutes, but I really wanted to take the time to talk about each of the problems with promises and observables and everything related to it in detail, so you get the right picture and all the necessary information about it. Of course, if you want to dive more into observables, check out RxJS. To promises, there are also more functions. We've seen all settle. There's also arrays and more that you can use with promises and the catch blocks in terms of chaining promises. But this is like the basic foundation that you really need to understand to build good applications. Really, if you don't understand the differences between promises and observables and overall the flow in your application when using asynchronous code, this can really cost you days of your time. If you also want to see another course on this topic, check out the Ionic Academy, in which I have a big course on promises and observables. And if anything is still unclear, let me know inside the comments, and otherwise hit the like, hit the subscribe so you get notified about the upcoming videos. I hope you enjoyed this. I've been Simon. This has been our JavaScript asynchronous deep dive. I will catch you next week like always. So happy coding, Simon.